In the early decades of the 20th century, the world was, well, it was basically falling apart. Old empires were collapsing, economies were in a free fall, and out of all that rubble, these incredibly radical new ideas started to grow, these visions for a completely remade society. Today, we're going to look at three of the most powerful and, frankly, most dangerous blueprints for building a new world.
So let's start with the story. It's 1945. There's an 11-year-old German boy named Helmut, and he overhears his dad, who's a pretty prominent doctor, say these exact chilling words. The very next day, his father takes his own life. That single, terrifying moment, it really captures the endpoint of one of these grand visions, the absolutely devastating human cost when these ideologies finally collapse. And that right there, that's the big question for our explainer today. See, Helmut's story wasn't just some isolated tragedy. It was the result of these massive historical forces. So what actually happens when the old ways of life just crumble and people get desperate for something new, something radical to take its place? To really get why anyone would be drawn to these radical blueprints, we first have to understand the sheer scale of the crisis people were living through. This was truly an age of unprecedented upheaval. I mean, just look at the speed of it all. In just a handful of decades, the world was hit by one shock after another. First, you've got this intense colonial expansion and industrialization cranking up global tension. Then, boom, the First World War just shatters a generation and wipes old empires off the map. Before the dust even settles, a revolution in Russia topples a monarchy that had been there for centuries. And then, as if that's not enough, the Great Depression brings the entire global economy to its knees. There was no time to breathe. It was just one crisis after another. So what you have is this perfect storm of chaos. You've got old empires and social structures just proving they can't handle it anymore. You have millions of people unemployed, filled with economic despair. For a country like Germany, there was this deep, profound national humiliation. All over the industrial world, workers are facing just brutal exploitation. And in the colonies, it's a ruthless scramble for resources. This wasn't just a political problem, you see. It was a crisis of meaning that left millions absolutely desperate for a clear, decisive solution. Okay, so out of all that chaos, our first blueprint emerges. It grew directly from the misery of Tsarist Russia, and it was a vision that promised to literally turn the world upside down, all in the name of the working class. And you can see just how radical this was when you put the two worlds side by side. It's night and day. On one side, you've got old Russia, a top-down autocratic empire, all the land owned by a tiny elite, and this huge population of desperately poor peasants. On the other side, the socialist vision, power to workers' councils or Soviets, land given to the peasants who actually worked it, and the state taking control of the entire economy. This wasn't about reform. It was a complete flip of the entire social order.
So how are they going to do it? Well, Lenin and the Bolsheviks offered a shockingly clear and simple plan. Step 1, get Russia out of the horrible First World War. Step 2, give the land to the peasants. Step 3, take control of every bank and every factory. These weren't some vague promises, they were concrete actions that spoke directly to the biggest pains of the Russian people. And that final step, setting up a one-party state, well, that was to make sure the revolution could never be undone.
This simple, three-word slogan, I mean, it's brilliant, right? It perfectly captured the essence of what the Bolsheviks were promising. It wasn't about some complex economic theory. It was about the three things people were literally starving for: peace from a war that felt pointless, land they could call their own, and bread to feed their families. It's got to be one of the most effective political slogans of all time.
But there was a horrific price. This number, 4 million, that represents the people who died in just one of the famines that came from putting this blueprint into action. The famine of 1930-33, caused directly by Stalin's forced collectivization. The dream of a worker's paradise was in reality built on a foundation of unbelievable suffering.
All right, let's shift gears to our second blueprint. This one came out of the ashes of Germany's defeat in World War I. And this vision wasn't fueled by class struggle, but by national humiliation and an absolute thirst for revenge.
So in Germany, the new vision was a direct reaction against what many people saw as a completely failed state. The Weimar Republic was tied to the humiliating Treaty of Versailles, it was seen as a chaotic and weak democracy, and it was plagued by crippling economic problems. The Nazi vision was its total opposite, a promise to tear up the treaty, build a powerful, unified state, give everyone jobs and security, and replace the weak politicians with a kind of messiah figure who could restore German pride.
It's hard to even wrap your head around this, but it was real. To get why Nazism was so appealing, you have to understand this level of chaos. When your entire life savings become worthless paper and you literally need a wheelbarrow full of cash just to buy groceries, well, the promise of simple order and stability starts to sound incredibly powerful.
And then, as if things weren't bad enough, boom, the Great Depression hits. By 1932, you've got 6 million Germans unemployed. 6 million. On the streets, men were wearing signs that just said willing to do any work. This widespread, gut-wrenching desperation was the fertile ground that allowed Nazism to grow from a tiny fringe movement into the biggest political party in the country.
So Hitler comes along, and his promises, they're like a checklist for every single one of those fears. He offered strength to a nation that felt weak. He promised to tear up a treaty they saw as a great injustice. He promised dignity to a people who felt humiliated. He promised jobs to the unemployed. And crucially, and ominously, he promised to purge the nation of anyone he decided was foreign, giving people a simple scapegoat for all of Germany's problems.
Okay, so our third blueprint is a little different. It wasn't born from some big, flashy revolution or a political takeover. No, this was a slower, more methodical project of remaking entire landscapes and societies, all in the name of imperial progress and profit.
What you're seeing here is a total collision of two ways of seeing the world. On the one hand, for local communities in places like India, the forest was everything. It was their grocery store, their pharmacy, their hardware store. But to the colonial state, all that diversity was just unproductive wilderness. Their vision was to replace all that chaos with these neat, orderly, single-species plantations designed for one purpose, making money for the empire by supplying timber for things like railways and ships. And of course, they gave it this very official, very modern-sounding name, scientific forestry. But let's be real, the science here was all about one thing, maximizing commercial output. Natural, biodiverse ecosystems were just torn down and replaced with what were basically tree factories, all planted in nice, straight rows so they were easy to cut down. And they rolled this out with cold, bureaucratic precision. First, they mapped and classified all the forests, declaring the best ones completely off-limits to locals. Then, they made traditional ways of life, like shifting cultivation or hunting, illegal. They actively ripped out diverse plants and replaced them with commercially valuable trees. The end goal was simple: systematically drain these vast, natural resources to fuel the needs of the empire. And, no surprise, just like our other blueprints, the human cost was staggering. This quote from the Baiga people in India, it's just heartbreaking. By making their traditional way of life a crime, the colonial state didn't just take away their resources, it took away their very identity and their ability to survive. Their scientific forest was a death sentence for communities who had lived in harmony with it for generations.
So, you've got socialism for the worker, rebirth for the nation, and resources for the empire. 3 very different blueprints, right? But when you step back and look at them all together, you start to see a very, very disturbing common pattern emerge: the true price of building these new worlds.
Okay, let's just lay it all out on the table. The socialist blueprint, it aimed for a classless society, but what it delivered was famine and tyranny. The Nazi blueprint aimed for a strong nation, but it unleashed genocide and a world war. The colonial blueprint aimed for progress, but it led to dispossession and starvation. So the big takeaway here is that in every single case, the utopian goal was used to justify catastrophic human suffering. It's a terrifying reminder of how the promise of a perfect future can be paid for with a truly brutal present.
And that leaves us with one final, kind of uncomfortable thought. These stories might feel like they're just history, but the patterns, they're timeless. Radical visions born from deep inequality, aggressive nationalism that's fueled by a crisis, the exploitation of people and nature, all in the name of progress. It really makes you wonder, which of these blueprints, or at least pieces of them, are still being sold to us today?